Likutei Sichos, Chelik Chafei, volume 25, the first Sicha for Parshas Toldos. This Sicha is a wonderful explanation into how Esav succeeded in tricking and fooling his father Yitzchak regarding the mitzvah of Meiser, and give us a little insight and appreciation of the mitzvah of Meiser. So just as an introduction, so we're familiar with some of the concepts and ideas that are discussed in the Sicha, to help us flow through the Sicha easier. The mitzvah of Meiser. Now, according to the Torah, meaning biblically mandated mitzvah of Meiser, is only gidulei karka, anything that grows from the ground. That means plant-based things, whether it's fruits, vegetables, produce, wheat, and so on. Now, anything that is attached to the fruits or vegetables, what is secondary to it, is not obligated to Meiser. For example, once you take the grains, you remove the grains of wheat out of the stalks, those stalks could be used as animal feed, right? Like hay. But those stalks don't have a value that requires it to be given for Meiser to be taken from it. Then we also are, I'm sure everyone's familiar with, Meiser Momed, the Meiser, the tithing we give for money. According to almost all the opinions, perhaps all the opinions, this is only midrabanan. This is rabbinically mandated. Of course, we do it, and this is a cornerstone of Yiddishkeit to give Meiser, but it's not min haTorah. Min haTorah, it's only plant-based that requires Meiser. And then there is another type of kind of Meiser, which we find in the Torah in several occasions, where after winning a war and coming back with the loot, they would have to give a certain amount from what they've just gained, from what they've just conquered, and give that to tzedakah or whatever it is. Now let's go into another thing about Klolei Rashi, the rules in Rashi, in how Rashi wrote his Pirush. It's true that Rashi sources all his explanations from Chazal, either from the Gemara or from Medrash. And typically, Rashi will try to quote almost verbatim, unless, of course, Rashi feels that it does not fully complement the Pshutei Shemikra. What I mean to say is, we'll see in the Sicha that sometimes Rashi, it's clear and evident that Rashi has a source in the Medrash, but yet Rashi chooses to change some key words or some key expressions. And typically, or exclusively I should say, it's always because this is what is important for Rashi's primary endeavor, which is Pshutei Shemikra, the simple, basic understanding of the pasuk. Also, another rule in Rashi, Pshutei Shemikra of Rashi doesn't necessarily always correspond and is not fully compatible always with the actual halacha as we know it. In other words, there are things that we can understand in the pasuk of Pshutei Shemikra, but halachically speaking, you cannot derive any conclusions because, in fact, the halacha is not like the way it appears in Rashi. Another thing to be familiar with, something that we learned back in Parshas Lech Lecha. So the story over there, when the people of Sodom and the other countries, the other kings were taken captive, and Avrohom pursued them, and then Avrohom killed those kings that took him captive, and then it says that Malki Tzedek, who actually was the Shem, the son of Noach, came to greet Avrohom and tell him he's not upset with him of having killed one of his descendants, which is one of those kings, and then it says, Vayitanoi Meiser Bikoil. Avrohom gave him a tithing from everything. Okay, what from what? Well, we learned that he gave him a tithing from everything that he owned, not just from the loot of the war, as we'll see later, but from anything that he owned. There's actually a very interesting discussion whether this has the status of Meiser, if it's considered Meiser or not. But in any case, we find that the Torah says and calls it Meiser. He gave a Meiser from everything. Another thing to be familiar with, Esav. Targum Yonasan ben Azil has a very interesting expression that says that the head of Esav lies there in the lap of Yitzchak. And as we know, factually, that the head of Esav rolled into the Maros of Achpelah and is buried right near Yitzchak. What is the significance, the spiritual significance of this? This indicates that Esav in his head, meaning in his shoydish, in the root, in his source, up there, spiritually speaking, is actually on a very, very, very high level. Although, as he, quote, fell down here, as he evolved and came down here and he manifested in actual life, he was an extreme Russia. He went all the way he evolved into total bad to the other extreme. One more thing, the idea of Gevura. We know Gevura means severity. Gevura means strength, literally translated. There is Gevura of Kedusha, and then there's the Gevura of Klippa. Gevura, in its pure form, can appear and come across as very, very negative. In Kabbalah, there's a rule that says that the Gevuros, in order to sweeten them, take out that negative punch of it, so to speak, that a Gevuros nimtokos b'sharsham, and they have to go all the way to the root of Gevura, to the highest point, and there you can sweeten the Gevura and actually turn it around into something extremely positive. So let's get into the Sikha itself. So on the verse that says, Vayigdu al Na'arim, that the two youths, that's Yaakov and Esav, they grew up, they became bar mitzvah, and then it says, Vayihi Esav ish yodei tzayid. Esav was a man who, literally translated, who knew hunting, meaning he was a skillful hunter. Esau, a man in the field. Rashi says on the words, the heading, Yodei tzayid. Now, what does it mean, Yodei tzayid? That he knew. It just said that he was a hunter. Why did he knew how to? He knew very skillfully, says Rashi, how to hunt, so to speak, how to cheat, how to fool his father with his mouth. What kind of things did he do in order to fool his father, to trick his father into thinking that he's a good guy? He would ask him, Father, how do you take meiser? Heyach ma'asrim misamelech. Heyach ma'asrim misateva. How do you take meiser from salt? How do you take meiser from hay? And Rashi concludes that his father thought, wow, look how he's medaktek with mitzvahs. Look how diligent he is with mitzvahs. Now the Farshim explain that Esav asked about these particular items, salt and hay, because really they are totally exempt from Meiser. So he wanted to kind of show that look how diligent I am, look how frum I am. Things that the halacha, the law, does not require me to give Meiser from, and here I want to give Meiser from that. I volunteer to give Meiser. But the Rebbe asked several questions. There's a problem with this. If Esav would have given Meiser from these things, okay, then he would have come across as a very diligent and observant person. Very diligent and frum, very, very observing of the mitzvahs. Okay, nice. But the fact that he's asking the question actually doesn't do the trick. It's just the opposite. This shows what kind of amma aretz, what kind of ignoramus he is. That he doesn't know the halacha. What do you mean how you meiser? You don't have to give meiser from salt and from hay. Okay, as we explained in the introduction, salt doesn't grow from the ground, and hay is just superfluous. It's not the actual produce itself. Moreover, Esav grew up in the house of Yitzchak. He was raised in his house. And if indeed he was so diligent about mitzvahs, he would have followed everything that he viewed and that he saw all these years. Whatever his father gave Meiser and how he gave Meiser, that's what he would have done. So what point is there? What place is there to ask now to try to impress Yitzchak? What are you asking? You grew up in a frum home. You saw what they did. Do the same. Now, when you look in Rashi's source, in the Medrash Rabbah, where it's obvious that is a source, over there's actually a different expression than what Rashi says. Over there it says that Esav asked, Heyoch mitaknim melach. Heyoch mitaknin teva. How do you prepare? How do you make it ready for use? Okay, how do you make it useful or fit for consumption? Rashi, however, deviates and writes Heyoch me'asrim es hamelach. See, if you go according to the Medrash, it makes sense. He's not really asking about mice. He's just asking, what do I need to do extra in order to make this perfectly kosher? But the moment you put it into the category of meiser, as we said, that shows amaratzis. That doesn't show diligence. That doesn't show frumkeit. That shows amaratzis. So it seems, comes out from this, it seems, that Rashi is amplifying the amaratzis of Esav by saying as if he is certain that you have to give meiser, he's just asking how you do it. What is going on over here? This question becomes even stronger and most obvious. If Esav is certain that one needs to give meiser from salt and from hay, give meiser. What's the question? Go ahead and give meiser. In other words, what is what's the room for discussion? How exactly did he manage to impress, obviously erroneously, his father? What exactly happened here? The answer is as follows. As discussed many times, Rashi's Pirush of Pshutoi Shel Mikra is not necessarily always 100% compatible and aligned with actual halacha as we know it now. The question how you give meiser from salt and hay would not be existent today because you don't have to. However, the question as Rashi presents it is not connected to the regular conventional meiser, as we said in the introduction. The meiser which we now give, we're obligated to give according to the Torah, once the Torah was given, after Matan Torah, and that is only from produce, only from plants that grow from the ground, but rather we're talking about a different type of meiser. And that meiser is the meiser which was common, which was practiced in those times, and that is to give meiser from everything. Where do we see it? We already quoted in the introduction where it says in Parshas Lech Lecha that Avrohom gave meiser from everything that was his. And it's not from the loot of the war. Because if you look closely, he didn't take any of the loot. Remember, he refused it. Melech Stoim said to him, take whatever you want. He refused it. So that wasn't his. And whatever he did take wasn't for him, was for the soldiers who fought. So Avrohom gave from everything that he owned. That is from all his own private possessions. And he gave meiser. And now Avrohom is the person the Torah itself attests that he didn't keep his good deeds for himself, but it says that Lamana sheyitzave esbanav, that Hashem loved Avrohom so much because everything he did, he taught to the next generation, and he passed on to his children and his children's children. So it's obvious that Esav grew up in a home where he saw Yitzchak doing what Avrohom did, and that is giving meiser from everything and anything that you own. And in fact, perhaps it can even be suggested that the idea of giving meiser wasn't only a condition of pre-Matan Torah, but the Rebbe goes even as far as suggesting, perhaps even if you argue that giving meiser from your possessions, meaning the things that have a monetary value, not necessarily grow from the ground, is only midrabanan, as we said in the introduction. But remember that we have a source which tells us that Avraham Avinu, kiyam es kol haTorah kula, he fulfilled the entire Torah, even those things like Eruvin, which are certainly and obviously hands down midrabanan, even that he fulfilled and he kept prior to Matan Torah. So certainly Avraham gave meiser from everything he owned. And that is why Esav is not on Am Haaretz by saying, hey, how do you give meiser from salt and from hay? He wasn't asking on the basis of the meiser of produce, but he was asking on the basis of you giving meiser from anything that you have that is of value. His question was precisely the way Rashi presents it. How do you give the meiser? What does that mean? What was his question? Salt and hay on their own, meaning by themselves, have a very, very minimal value. However, when you mix it with other things, it enhances its effect and therefore its value. Think of it. Salt, not so expensive. It doesn't even have a good taste. It's bitter. However, when you take a little salt and you mix it into a dish, you mix it into something you're cooking, that whole thing becomes enhanced. It brings out the flavors. Hey, straw. What value does it really have? It's almost meaningless. You feed it to animals maybe, but it's a very, very cheap and lowly value. However, if you take that very same straw, that very same hay, and you mix it now, and you turn it in, and then you bake it, and you turn it into bricks, now it has a tremendous value. You take those bricks and you build a building, now the building has a real estate value. And that was his question. When I'm giving meiser from my salt and from my hay, how do I evaluate its value? Do I look at it as it is now? Very small value, and it's a very minimal meiser. Or do I view it as the potential and what can come out of it and what it can lead to, the enhancement that it can bring, and thus maybe perhaps I have to consider it as being more valuable than it is right now. And this explains why Yitzchak, when he heard that, he actually was impressed. And he thought, wow, my son is not only doing the mitzvahs as he was brought up to do, but he is diligent about the mitzvahs. He wants to know to what extent he has to give the meiser, how to look at it, to look at it what it's worth now or what it's potentially going to be worth later. And that's what impressed Yitzchak. And that's a legitimate impression. Of course, Esav didn't really mean it, but it was enough to fool Yitzchak. Now, we know that in Rashi, the Rebbe always points out, and it's based on sources, that in addition to the Pshutai Shemikra, we know that Rashi incorporates all levels of explanation of the Torah, even Yeina Shel Torah. Yeina Shel Torah means the wine of Torah, which means wine brings out the secret, the side. So in Rashi, we can also now find, now that we understand this Rashi, we can appreciate the Yeina Shel Torah. And what is that? The question really is, okay, I understand how we explained it, but why did Esav choose these two particular items? There are other things also that in and themselves maybe are not worth so much, but then when they're added to something, or when they enhance the taste in something, or the quality of something, now they have an enhanced value. So why did he pick these two particular items? So the Rebbe says, if we look in the brachas that Yitzchak gave to Yaakov, that he wanted to give to Esav, at the end he gave it to Yaakov, the Alter Rebbe asks, Yitzchak was very well aware of who Esav was. In fact, he said it himself, clearly in the pasuk. When Yaakov starts speaking about God, Yitzchak is like, whoa, are you really Esav? Is this really you? In other words, he knew who Esav was. So why would he want to give him the brachas? The answer is because Yitzchak knew that the Esav that's in front of him is not the real Esav. In his shoresh, in his source, up there, Lamaila, Esav is in fact on a very, very, very high level. And in other words, in his potential, he's phenomenal. It's just that the way he manifests himself down here, unfortunately, he's not. And what Yitzchak intended to do was, perhaps he hoped that if he gives him the blessings, he can elevate him, he can bring out of him, he can trigger in him that success of going back to his shoresh and transforming into total good. You see, the shoresh of Esav is Gevura. Yitzchak was also Gevura. But Yitzchak is Gevura of Kedusha, whereas, of course, Esav was Gevura of Klipa. And what Yitzchak was hoping to do was connect to him and get into the depth of his Gevura, to trigger it, and there to bring out the best in Esav. You see, these two things Esav chose, and with this he felt that connection with his father, Gevura to Gevura, because these two things have a remez to Esav, because these are two things that in and themselves, they're total Gevura. Where do you see it? Salt, as we said, is very, very bitter. It represents Gevura. Salt is a symbol of Guras. And by itself, you can't eat it. Try to eat a scoop of salt. But when you put a little bit of it into food, it sweetens it. It makes it delicious. Why? Because we know the rule that the Gevurais are nimtokim b'sharsham. How do you sweeten Gevurais? By their salt. You go to the root of it, to the source of it. You take the salt itself, you put a little bit of it in, and it sweetens everything up. And likewise with hay. Chassidus explains that chaff or hay or that type of stuff, they're really all refuse, which is basically, it's the refuse of the wheat, right? And it's not really anything of any plausible quality, any tangible quality. They're really nothingness. And that is, in Chassidic terms, that is considered to be, it has the aspect of klipa. What does Esav wanted to do? He wanted to take from the klipa, right? Esav, who prides himself to be klipa, and he wants to be mevar, he wants to elevate the meiser from the klipa itself. Or as we said, when you take the hay, for example, a practical application, and you turn it into a brick, you use that, the hay and the straw, to turn into a brick. Now that becomes something productive, something of building, not of klipa, which breaks things down. So in short, this was the way that he tried to manipulate his father knowing that his father, and we see the parallel that his father tried because of this to connect to his shayrish of Gevura to transform it and sweeten it and bring out the positive.